Right, it's recording now.
Okay, what was you saying?
Okay, so I mean the whole movement is really based on being anti-establishment, really. So in the early 70s, when I was quite young, everything was pretty much controlled by big record companies and big producers, and you had to dress a certain way. It was all very formulaic, especially in music. So a bit like the Simon Cowell stuff today, and that's why some people are a bit anti Simon Cowell and things like X Factor, because although it's a quick way to get famous, you've got to do what you're signed to do. So Simon Cowell's got a very strict set of rules. When they sign on their sort of dotted line, they're not going to make big money. He makes the money. He buys your clothes. He gives you a flat. And a lot of the guys, you see them like leaving after a couple of years because they suddenly think, well, I've sold millions of records and where's the money gone? And that's what it was back in the day. So people sort of realised and thought, well, we could actually do this ourselves. You know, why can't we just do it ourselves? Because there's always been people that have made their own music and done their own stuff and toured in pubs and places like that, and they could never get signed. They'd always be blocked by the big shows, and they'd sort of say, well, who are you? You know, you're not on any decent record label. Why do we want you? And then you had clever people in the background, people like Malcolm McLaren, obviously quite famous guy, who in a way did what a lot of these big studios did. He was quite clever in that he sort of saw an opening, that if he could give people the support and the clout to get a record deal out there, to organise them. So he made money out the back, but not quite at the level of some of the big companies. And he linked in with Vivienne, who obviously was a partner with Vivienne. So from a fashion perspective, it was very much looking at where we are and really throwing the book out the window. So men can wear dresses and skirts and girls can do whatever they like. And if you want to turn a bin bag into a dress, you just do it. So there weren't particular rules. You just had to be non-conforming. So that's why you see people with the spiky hair and the hair colours and lots of piercing. And it did splinter off into other areas. So you've got things like the goth movement came via punk, because some people went down the sort of more Halloween-y black hair, black clothes, leather look. You had like new wave, which was a bit less punky, but a bit more. They were better musicians. They tend to be able to play, and they wanted to make money, and they had a set sound. So it broke into lots of different factions, and lots of different groups came out of it. Because before that, you either had mixed men and women singing, so you had mixed groups, and they'd always be in like suits and dresses, and it'd be quite acceptable to your grandma type music, very sort of middle of the road. You wouldn't even know the words. It would just be a nice tune. So sort of nice tunes you get in lifts. So pretty dull, really. And then you also had like heavy metal that sort of started, but that was all a bit, everyone was in double denim. So it was just double denim fest. So it wasn't particularly a fashion look. It was more appealing to people who were into bikes and things like that. So they'd all dress the same. But the music was very much similar, just loud and lots of guitar. So in terms of things like album covers, I mean, I've got some I can photograph, and maybe I can email them over. So people they use different approaches. So sometimes you'd use photography, so they just put images together that didn't match.
Yeah.
So you might get a face and a bird and a dustbin. Sometimes it would be, back in the day, we didn't have such good computer stuff at all. So you didn't have the ability to upload an image and edit it. It was very much sticking bits of paper together and photocopying. So you get people that would type out fanzines or type out or draw out things and then glue them together, and that would be the album cover. So it would look like someone had made it themselves. So it was a lot of handmade type approach. So I've got one that it was the record was I'm in Love with Margaret Thatcher, who obviously everyone hated Margaret Thatcher at the time. She was uber conservative. So they'd got an image of her and they changed it so she was given a V sign, and it was basically her photograph but someone else's hand. So they'd photograph the photograph and that became the cover of the record. So it's thinking a bit outside the box. So with I can't think what was on the original Ripper to Shreds. I think it was Debbie Harry's face. probably look at what they originally and just do something, whatever you feel like talks about the lyrics. So sometimes an album cover or a record, there's a lot more 7-inch, a lot of single music. So it would be quite literal. So it would be the image of whatever the song was. So I've got Bela Lugosi, which was a song done a bit later by one of the slightly later punk style bands, Bauhaus. And it's an old still from an old black and white movie about vampires, and that's the front cover. So it's all grainy. They blew it up, but it didn't blow up very well, but that didn't matter. So today you'd get a perfect image. Someone would get the original film and they'd take a download, they'd put it on a computer and they'd make it perfect. But back then things weren't perfect. You know, sometimes you'd get overlapped images and you could see it was all bit handmade. So it's a lot more basic. So I think if you're going to try and recreate something along that theme, you don't want it to look perfect. You want it to look like you've taken different themes and sort of crushed them together and made something, and use maybe different textures. Maybe if you're going to use, I mean, sometimes people would use like bits of material, bits of paper and stuff like that all together, and then photograph that, and that would become the album cover. Or you'd get pictures of if you had quite a band, I mean, the Sex Pistols, they didn't really use their own image. They used to use statements. So you've got Never Mind the Bollocks, which was their first one. And the fact that they used the word bollocks, which we all say now, but back then you would not say it. It was, you know, it's still an offence to swear in public, but the police don't really ever arrest people swearing in public unless you're doing something else. But back then you couldn't say, you know, the F word, you couldn't say any of those words, they could arrest you. So the fact they used that on an album, right, great big letters, and they had the other image, which is the Queen with the nose ring. So that's the God Save the Queen symbol. So they used a normal picture of the Queen and then put a nose ring and a chain and made her look punky. So sometimes you'd use a standard. You might take a picture of Buckingham Palace, so that's really boring and ordinary, but someone would go at it with paint out the windows or make it look different, but we'd all know what it really was. It had just been completely revamped. So you could do something along those sort of lines.
Yeah.
I mean, someone like Debbie Harry herself, she was the first person to wear like a bin liner as a dress. I think she turned up on Top of the Pops and she just literally had a pair of tights on and a black bag, and that was an outfit. So that was quite extreme. So I remember sitting with my grandma and mum, and they'd be like, "Oh, look at that, it's disgusting. How could they?" You know, it was just done to shock, but actually it was fashion. The same with like the wearing the bondage trousers. So they were just really tight leg trousers, you know, like the ultra skinny jeans you get now.
Yeah.
So you'd get ultra skinny jeans, but then people would get things like they'd get a dog collar and stitch a dog collar across the trousers, so your legs would be tied together. So, or chains, just to make it, you know, awkward. So a lot of that stuff was a bit awkward to wear, a bit awkward to wear, actually move around or do anything in. So what ideas have you got? Have you got any specific ideas?
No, we're just doing like basic research just of like the punk era and the styles and stuff of that time. Like, do you remember what the main like styles were like with the punk?
Well, I suppose a lot of people went into you'd show it with your hair quite often. So hair and lots of piercings. People would have like pins through their nose or through their ears, and you'd use like great big nappy safety pins because it would make you look obvious. Now, a lot of people, you'd leave your house dressed in normal clothes and get changed when you went out, because a lot of people's parents, you know, would be like, "You're not going out in that," or "What you think you're doing wearing that?" So people would go out in like normal clothes and take a bag and get changed, and they'd have to remember to get changed before they got home.
Yeah.
So a lot of it was easy. You could sort of, you know, some of the people like Jordan, who I sent pictures of you, I think he worked in the sex shop. She used to backcomb her hair up, and they'd quite often at that point, they'd wear something really controversial. So they'd wear a swastika. So people of their parents' ages would remember the war and the Nazi symbolism of a swastika. but swastikas are actually used in Hindu art and other things. So it's not just about being a Nazi, but it was to shock people. So you could be in a completely smart outfit, but you'd wear a badge, or you'd have something, you know, you might have your hair spiked up. I had one friend that used to use a glue it's like an organic glue, but pre-super glue. He'd put loads of this stuff in his hair to make his hair stand on end. In the end, he went bald because he had to just take it all off because it destroyed his hair. But people would use anything like water to get your hair up. And we didn't have all the posh gels and hairsprays. So I know another friend, he used to do a lot of stuff with his hair, but it was quite flammable. And he didn't think about it. So when he was smoking, he actually set his hair on fire because he'd use, I think, Elnet hairspray. You could always get Elnet, which makes your hair like concrete. So he'd spent hours hanging upside down and getting everyone in turn to hairspray his hair up. But it made his hair really flammable. So he had to, it was the middle of, I remember it was a party, turned around, he was like, oh, your hair's on fire. And everyone was like running over, throwing stuff on him, trying to put his hair out. But in terms of, it was just really to shock. So for girls, you'd either be in very mannish, you'd be trousers tight, you quite often as tight fitted, so you'd almost show, like if you had big chest, you'd show off your big chest. But if someone looked at you, you'd have a go at them, like who you're looking at. If I want to show them, I'll show them, but it's not for you to look at. A lot of the time it was quite fashionable to rip and tear clothes. So say you had an old pair of jeans, you'd go at them with scissors and cut, like you see people now, people cut the knees and the bottom out of them. That was quite a punky thing to do. Or dye them. A lot of people tie-dyed as well, just to make it look really outrageous. I can remember wearing my primary school blazer. So a school blazer that was from primary school, just because it was really purpley, and putting loads of badges. I used to put loads of different badges of different bands that I'd seen or bands that I liked. So you'd see people with leather jackets and stuff, and they'd have bad little pin badges all down their sleeve of all the people that they liked. On the backs of leather jackets, people would paint the anarchy symbol, you know, the A with a circle around it, or names of bands with white, you know, so people would build up. If say they'd seen someone like the Clash, who was a really big group at the time, or the Damned, quite often if they had a leather jacket or a leather waistcoat, it'd be covered in art. They put anything off the albums, if there was any symbols, like the Stranglers had a song called Rattus Leviticus, which is about the black rat. So people would have little rats painted on because it would be a link to the Stranglers. Or the Damned had one of their big songs was Smash It Up, because people would go and just go nuts. So a lot of people would have t-shirts with Smash It Up, but it'd be written really small. So you'd have to get quite close and think, oh, it's the Damned. So you'd know lines from the song or song titles. So it was probably the start of wearing band-related merchandise as well, with the name of the band. That got quite popular. It's a lot more popular now. Most people, I can remember having monkey boots, which are like cheap Dr. Martens. So I had monkey boots and a pair of Dr. Martens shoes. I quite like the chunky shoes. And friends, most people had the 8 or 9 hole Dr. Martens, like the oxblood colour, so a bit skinheady, because he obviously, at the same sort of time, some of the skinhead type people were attracted to punk because there was a lot of fighting sometimes involved, and some people went just purely for the punch up. I mean, I never went to a concert where there was masses of spitting, because I'm not, just think it's a bit pointless. But I know I did go to one in Brighton when I was at college, which was the lead singer of the Sex Pistols, John Lydon, set up another band, Public Image Limited, after that. And as he walked on stage, a load of people just gobbed. I mean, it was just this like a shower of spit, and he walked off and he was like, I've been through that and I'm not doing it now. I'm not here to be spat on. So they had to go and like convince him to come back out and play the music. So that wasn't a very nice. But I mean, in terms of in London, there were a lot of one-hit wonders. So a lot of people knew other people in different bands. So they'd be in this band this week, then they move on to another band, then they move on to another band, and then they might go back to their first band. So if you look at some of the music, the lineups, you see people in this band that came out in that band, and then they got famous in that band, and then they went back to that band, or they played guitar for them on one song, and that song was quite famous. So there's a lot of movement between groups and styles, but so usually quite dark clothing, band names, lots of hair decoration. eye makeup, things like eye makeup for the girls, it was really dark eyeliner, bit more gothic, but very dark eyeliner. So if you looked at someone like Susie of the Banshees, she's a bit post-punk, so she's sort of she's on the line between punk and gothic. But her look, she used to quite often, she was one of the Bromley contingent, so one of the early group that used to hang around in the shop in King's Road, in the sex shop. So she had her hair very dark and spiky. She'd quite often wear a swastika. She'd always have tight clothes. She'd always be quite feminine. But if someone looked at her, she'd punch them in the face and knock them out, because she these are for me, these are not for you. If I want to walk around and show my body off, that's not for you to stare at. So it's that sort of attitude.
Do you have any pictures of you, or like of anyone from?
I don't have many of me, because I'm not having my photo taken at that stage, which I know you know that feeling. I think it's just that period in time. I've got a friend that she might have one, Cassie, that I think you might have met once. My friend now has got sort of longish blonde hair. She had blonde hair at school, and over a holiday time, I think this when we were about 15. So we finished school, say at Easter, and came back in the summer. So she went from long blonde hair to black spiky sticking up hair, and a lot of the teachers thought she was new. They just didn't know it was her because she looked so different. So I'll see if she's got some before and after pictures, but I can see if I can find some.
Yeah, see if you can find any pictures from like the late 70s, like 80s kind of.
Yeah. I mean, you see, there is, if you Google, there's someone that actually put quite a lot of pictures of punks in London in the 70s, and there's quite that should be online. I'll see if I can find it for you. And you can see that some people were really, they really looked the part, but sometimes the friends in the background, not everyone's the same. There's an element of the spiky hair, and people would dye that say have like black, but have the Mohican might be orange or red or a really bright color. So it's there's no sort of set look, but everyone would sort of fit in. I mean, I wore army clothes for quite a long time, to grandma's disgust. She used to buy me all these nice dresses and I wouldn't wear them. So we used to go to army surplus shops, which you don't have anymore really. So they were like charity shop type shops, so really cheap, but they would sell off surplus army clothes. So you could go and get combat trousers, combat jackets, black, green shirts, all the sort of plain colours, and the boots. You could always get army boots, and they were really cheap. So a lot of people might get cheap trousers from a place like that and boots, but then spend some money on a nice band t-shirt. So they'd make their outfit that way. So it'd be like a homemade effort to try and look good. So army surplus was a bit on the outside as well. Some people like to wear those sort of clothes.
What would you say? What genre of music would you say Blondie was?
I think Blondie is a bit like Susie and the Banshees. They are considered punky, but they're also new wave. So punk and new wave sort of ran together. So with the American side, because obviously Blondie was an American act, their punk scene was a little bit different. And you've got their first, I suppose, real punk band was the New York Dolls. So if you Google New York Dolls, you'll see the lead singer looked a bit like a transvestite, but he was a man, but he used to have all his hair all back combed. So they're like the equivalent in America to the Sex Pistols were here, and they were all really quite bright characters, and they linked to some of the Andy Warhol type, I'm going to do what I want and do what I like. And Blondie evolved from a New York scene around that same sort of time. So she'd sung in other bands as well, but Blondie was that was her big success, and they're still going now. She did take time out in the 90s because she was in a relationship with Chris Stein, who's one of the members of the band, the bassist, I think, either bassist or lead guitar, and he had a strange illness. So she sort of basically, they stopped performing and stopped touring while he was really unwell. But then they came back and they've sort of carried on. So to be going sort of 50 years later is pretty good. though she's not the slim lady she was. She's in her 70s and she can get up and belt out a tune like anybody else. So it's quite good. I get to experience it twice. The Ramones is another American band that are worth having a look at. Now, they had a very set look, which on the face of it, you'd look at them and think heavy metal band, because they all wore jeans, black leather jackets, and they had quite, it's called a page boy haircut. So it's like a bowl cut. So you've got fringe and a long around the back of your neck. And they had a very distinct sound. And they are considered to be punky more than a metal-y band, and that's because of the nature of the wording of the songs. But if you looked at them, you'd almost assume they were part of the heavy metal scene, because they looked like rockers, and they were rockers, but punk rockers. So they're quite interesting guys to look at.
What different genres of punk is there? Like, what different?
The main, I mean, punk rock. It sort of, everybody that calls themselves punk. No two are the same. So you've got some like the Buzzcocks maybe and Tenpole Tudor that are more poppy and more acceptable. So, and then you've got people like Crass, or some of the ones that oi bands, which became a skinhead more. They were more into the loud, shouty, more like having a punch up at every gig type punk element. So from punk, other things have grown, other factions have grown. So it's like a core idea that's told everyone, you don't have to be signed to a big record label. You don't have to wear a blue suit and have a nice guitar and have a nice haircut and look like you go to church on a Sunday. You can do whatever you like. So that's the punk ethos. And then from that, all these little factions have splintered out. So new wave groups came more in the 80s, so late 70s, early 80s. And you've got things like the Undertones in Ireland, Stiff Little Fingers, which they're sort of punk, but different again. And they have quite a political message behind some of their songs about the British in Ireland and the Troubles and all that sort of background. You've got people like Madness and the Selector and the Coventry, the Specials, which became two-tone. So they were around at the start, but then became more into the sort of reggae aspect of using the reggae beat and reviving two-tone and ska. So that's a different genre, but they came around the same sort of time. They sort of appeared in the 80s. And they're more acceptable to the culture, because they're not as extreme. Although if you listen to the words of the songs, they're saying it how it is and what it's like in for teenagers and young people at the time, and they cover all sorts of topics. But if your mum looked at them, they go, oh, look at those nice boys in their suits playing that nice bouncy music. They're not really listening to the words. Listen to the words. It's a bit more about not having anti-black or anti-white. It's everyone together and enjoying the same sort of music. So it is quite a diverse time, and quite lucky that I was the right age at that time, because it was always changeable. You never knew what was going to come next. So there's a lot of one-hit wonders. You sort of think, wow, and then that group then disappears because they weren't signed to a big label. They literally got the record made in their garage, taped it, got a record deal, got the record made, and it was done, and everyone bought it. So there's all sorts of weird things, like the Not Sensibles, the Margaret Thatcher song. I think that was their one big hit. Didn't really do anything else, although they toured for quite a long time. They used to be, back in the sort of 70s and 80s, the student sort of rock band sort of circuit really got going. So you've got all the big massive venues like the Wembleys and the big places up in London, but a lot of the smaller bands and the punk groups would be touring universities like you have today. You have bands that you can go to a gig, you don't pay a lot of money, and they're brilliant. Now they might not get any further, but you might see them a lot of times when you're at college, because they tour the colleges. They know they've got an audience. I think it's easier now. They can stream things and put stuff on YouTube and have a channel. We didn't have any of that. You had to be seen and heard. So it's a bit of a different time.
How do you think like the styles in punk have changed from when it started to now?
I think it became commercialised quite quickly. It did become commercialised quite quickly, because like anything, you started to see like the Miss Selfridge shops, and even, you know, those sort of shops would pick up on like the sort of tight skirts or the tight blouses or this ripped element, and they'd make them a more acceptable middle of the road version. So you started to see what used to be handmade one-off outfits, and if that person was famous, they were seen on TV a lot, the shops would go, well, we could make a blue leather jacket with a zip, and a biker jacket that's a fashion item, so it's not actually a biker jacket, someone's adapted. So like anything, once it became popular, probably by the time we got to the late 70s, 80s, those sort of fashions are more acceptable, and people had found a niche. They thought, well, with any fashion, you've got the people at the start that do it themselves, and then you've got the followers of that fashion who may not have the skill to make a dress or make a skirt. I can remember sewing things, and my sewing was not brilliant, so it was easier for me to buy some things, which is probably why I wore army trousers quite a long time, because it was easier. But probably towards the 80s, you could buy, I don't know if you've seen it, you can get tubing. You could just cut the tubing off, hem it, and make a skirt. So I went through a phase of making a lot of quite short skirts using tubing because it was really simple. But then you'd see them in the shops. You'd start to see tube skirts in the shop, and they were quite a fashion in the 90s. So over time, people see it, and I think today there's a bit more of a revival into all the old punk bands. A lot of them have done 40-year tours, 45-year anniversaries. So people have rebought the T-shirts of those bands, and you see them being worn a lot now. And I wish I'd kept all of mine, because some of the old ones, you can sell them and people want the old ones. Like, for instance, I've got a friend that makes T-shirts. It's his business, so he makes them for bands. And during the lockdown, I've got one that says, it's got two great big buses, like tour buses. On the front one says nowhere. On the front, the other says boredom. And it's like lockdown 2020, the year we did nothing. And he also did the God Save the Queen face, but with a mask on. So for 2020, which I thought, because he's lost a lot of business, he does a lot for the small bands. They can order like 20, 30 shirts, and he'll go and sell them at a venue. But he just thought, well, I've got to do something, I've got to make some money.
Yeah.
But you can find a lot of the old God Save a lot of the original shirts and original designs. If you look on the internet, loads of people make them. A lot of them are making them without any license, but people want them as a fashion item. People want to wear the God Save the Queen because it's an iconic image. So there's quite a few. There's a Clash image of Paul Simon smashing his bass guitar. That's very famous, and you see those T-shirts around as well.
I can't think of any other questions. Like, when did it start? When did the punk movement start?
It's probably 76, around 76. 1976 was a really hot summer year. And we'd had before that in the early 70s, things had been really difficult. You know, I can remember having to come home from school. There was no electricity in the 70s because there was miners' strike. There was all sorts of problems and things going on. There was periods of time when there was rubbish in the streets. But around sort of 76, there was the Silver Jubilee of the Queen due in 1977. So she'd been on the throne 25 years. And that was the year that the Sex Pistols really came to the fore, which is where the God Save the Queen song came from. I think I sent you a quick clip. They hired a boat to go down the Thames on the same day as the Queen was doing a lot of stuff at Buckingham Palace. And they actually got arrested for noise nuisance, I think. I think that's how they got arrested, because they were blasting out God Save the Queen as they sailed down the river. But that was 76, 77. I think that was the point where everything had been a bit rubbish in the early 70s. And then people were starting to come out of that. We'd had a nice year in 76. And then people started to have a bit more money in their pocket. So teenagers had a bit more pocket money. You could go and start seeing these bands. A lot of the people I saw in my sort of 16, 17, you were paying £1.50, £2 to go to a venue. So it's not a lot of money out of your whole week's work. When I worked as a 16-year-old, I think my first wages was £16 for 2 days' work. And I spent most of that on records, as you do, and going to see them. But I think that's the time people started to think, right, I've had enough of the mainstream. There's nothing on them. A lot of the music on the radio is boring. And Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood had started the sort of movement in terms of fashion. So that was you'd see it in the paper. You'd see it. I used to buy things like the NME, New Musical Express, because we didn't have internet. So you were starting to see photographs. So it is sort of 76, 77, and it sort of ramps up 78. And then new wave starts to come in then, and everything breaks down into different factions. You've got the two-tone movement, and there's lots of choice. Suddenly there's lots of choice and lots of different music, and people almost used to wear the uniform of the music they liked. I just changed my clothes depending on what I was going to go and see. So if I was going to go and see Madness or the Specials, I'd be in black and white, because that was very much the ska look and the tight trousers and the white shirt type thing. But that's what you did back then, because you wanted to fit in and feel like you were part of that movement.
What was the different styles for the different movements?
Well, I think with things like two-tone, it's very much because it's about uniting black and white cultures, and you've got reggae being sung, and the bands are always quite mixed. So there was a big theme of wearing like black and white. So most you can still search that, you see that now. So it would be Dr. Martin type shoes or loafers for girls, and the boys. The blokes sometimes would also have DMs and tight jeans, but you'd wear black jackets, white shirts, or black and white, and pork pie hats and things like that. So that was a slightly different look. And then depending on other groups, I mean, I remember going to see the Undertones, which were Irish band at the sort of time. It was quite acceptable to go in your tatty old anorak, because the lead singer used to wear an old-fashioned style parka with the woolly, so they were all in cheap jeans, old shirts, because that was the sort of clothes they wore. So you'd try and dress according to what band you were going to go and see. Now you'd want to fit in, and that's that was the sort of theme at the time, and that carried on for a number of years, really, into the sort of late 80s and 90s. You had things that came after, things like the Smiths. Everyone wanted to look like Morrissey, so all the boys would have their hair back combed up. They'd all have tight jeans on and a shirt. So you'd sort of follow whatever group you were going to go see. You might have seen them on Top of the Pops, and you'd sort of emulate what they were wearing, because you think that was quite trendy. And you had people like Adam and the Ants came a bit after punk, so they're in the sort of new wave. He used to change his look quite frequently depending on his single. So the first single, it was very dark eyes and almost gothic, and then he did Kings of the Wild Frontier album, so they were dressed in Native American type clothes and feathers in their hair. And then the next album, he was more Regency, so he was like the Prince Regent in smart clothes, and he'd have little bows painted on his face. So you'd look at the album, you'd look at the artist, and you think, right, for this album, this is what they're doing, and you try and emulate those outfits.
Yeah, I think that's all my questions.
Okay,
thanks for answering all them.
That's all right. What I'll do is I'll try and figure out how to email you this recording so that you've got it. Text me on WhatsApp what's the best email, and then I'll find some photos as well. All right.
Okay, thank you.
All right then. Bye.
Bye.